Want to introduce myself. My name is Bolton Colburn, and I am the curator of collections and exhibitions at the Nora Eccles Harrison Museum of Art at Utah State University in Logan, Utah. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our format for a second, so everybody has some idea of what we're doing. We're going to give 5 minutes to each artist to talk a little bit about their work. We'll be showing you the work that is in the exhibition. One note that's kind of important is that you can go to the Nora Eccles Harrison Museum of Art website and go to the exhibitions page, and you can also see the exhibition the day after tomorrow, in which all their work is exhibited in a virtual tour. So you might want to check that out during our discussion and conversation here today. After each artist talks a little bit about their work, we will have a coffee table style conversation regarding important events of the day. And that'll range, I'm sure, from COVID to Black Lives Matter to global warming and the fires in California to the presidential election and our vice presidential debate today in Salt Lake City. So welcome to everybody that's gone online to see and hear us today. And I want to talk a little bit about the exhibition in which these artists are involved before I introduce the artists. And it's an exhibition called The Day After Tomorrow. It's been broken down into 3 different themes. One is a better tomorrow. The second theme is a worse yesterday. And the third theme is a wry ecosystem. And the exhibition was built in response to the COVID pandemic, and we did it fairly quickly. It's been up on the walls and open to the public since June 26th, and it will remain on exhibition through December 19th. So if you have a chance to see the exhibition in person, I encourage you to do so. So the first artist I'm going to introduce here is Constance Mallinson, and she was born in Washington, received her BA from the University of Georgia, Athens in 1970. And during the last 15 years or so, she has taught painting, drawing, and criticism in many colleges and universities in Southern California, including Claremont Graduate University, UCLA, UCSB, etc. Constance her work deals with Western concepts of the landscape, and I'm going to let her take it away from here. Constance.
Well, thank you, Bolton, and thank you for including me in the exhibition. It's very exciting, and I look forward to some of the things that are said today. And cut me off if I go after 5 minutes, because I will go on. You know, one of the nice things about this exhibition is seeing a work I hadn't seen in 35 years, or even thought about for that matter. That is a painting from the mid-'80s. And so this year seems to be a year of really thinking retrospectively for me. I was also included in a Museum of Contemporary Art, MoCA, LA, historical exhibit on the pattern and decoration movement from the late 70s and early 80s. And so that was an abstract piece, a number of abstract pieces that I did then. And so, you know, I'm looking over the course of a 50-year painting career here, which is a lot for me to sort of wrap my mind around, and the different phases that one can go through, different approaches. and finding myself wanting to look for common threads. You know, will the real Constance Mallinson please stand up? That kind of thing. Who is she? What does this 50-year career tend to consist of? So the abstract work from the late 70s, early 80s was the work in the pattern show. Well, let me say the thread that I think ties this 50-year career, backtrack a little bit, together is a sense of wanting to challenge the status quo of painting. And I can now look back and see that every different phase that I went through had that element to it. So the abstract work in the MoCA show was a feminist take on abstraction. There were many feminists challenging the hegemony of male-owned abstract painting and introducing these elements of female craft and female workmanship and a female sensibility into abstract art. So I'm going to try to get through this as quickly as possible. But from there, in the mid-'80s, when the piece in your show was made, I returned to figuration from pure abstraction. And even though there were elements of landscape embedded in the abstract work, I decided I wanted to get back to a little more literal or representational look at the landscape. Now you'll notice in the graphic that you bring up that there's this texture on the painting. It's a little hard to see in the full view, but that texture sort of harks back to the fabric-like nature of my abstract paintings, and also seems to reference the pixelation of photographic imagery. So there's a nice kind of segue from the sort of textile-looking abstract work into this figurative or representational work. So mid-'80s, everyone was thinking deconstruction. It was the Metro Pictures era. These ideas were very influential on me. Everyone was reading Baudrillard and Society of the Spectacle and Lyotard, and so postmodernism was really in the air. And like the Metro Pictures people, I was very interested in how photographic representation was impacting our culture, the way we saw things. And so having dealt with the landscape somewhat in the early work, I thought, well, I'm going to just take this head on and work with multiple landscape representations. So I came up with this kind of collage effect where if you think about the traditional landscape, which might be one little fragment of this composite landscape or this collage landscape, that's the view of nature that we've basically gone with for hundreds of years. Whenever landscape painting came into its own in the early 19th century. So in keeping with this idea of wanting to challenge the status quo of something, I said, well, I don't want to do just a traditional landscape. I'm going to introduce these multiple points of view and sort of destabilize this fixed point perspective, which in my mind had been aligned with this kind of I-it domination of nature. And, so shake it up, have this kind of skitsy, wild, non-fixed view of the landscape. And so I worked within this format for quite some time. The end part of this collage landscape, and you can see one behind me done from about 2008, were these large-scale panoramic landscapes that were created from hundreds and hundreds of different landscape images. So they're pretty labor-intensive. And again, the idea was that the single landscape view no longer sufficed to describe our relationship with nature and our, it's very complex, of course, can't be distilled into a few sentences, but a lot of people describe this work as landscape for the information age or landscape for the internet age, where, you know, it's all about endless proliferating imagery. So, so I did that. I did these collage landscapes for, gee, let's say 20 years. They were, of course, using appropriated mass media photographs. So it's anything from National Geographic to calendars to basically postcards. Any landscape image I felt would work, I used. And so it did come to a point where I wanted to kind of go beyond the appropriation of photo imagery, and in 2008 I returned to observational painting from things that I brought into the studio, still using a kind of collage format, and I began to create scenes from things that I picked up on my daily walks through the neighborhood. So there's a little bit of a performative aspect to it now. So instead of just copying hundreds and hundreds, thousands, I would say by now, photographs of the landscape, I'm finding things, bringing them back, and setting them up in my studio, and making today collages of primarily post-consumer waste, or in trash is another way of putting it. So I'm creating these large-scale paintings with huge accumulations of items that I pick up on the streets of LA and in my neighborhood. And so I'm now focused more on the consumer society and its impact on the landscape, on nature. And so while doing that, I also am curating exhibitions, and I'm a writer, so I do essays, reviews, lots of critical writing. And so in the last couple years, I've curated a number of shows. Decomposition was an exhibition of ruins through contemporary artists' eyes. After that, I did Urban Nature, which was at Art Center here in LA. And that was artists look at nature in the urban environment. After that, I did The Feminine Sublime for the Pasadena Museum, which looked at the tradition of the sublime, which was typically the Kantian sublime seen through a male perspective, turned it on its head, and interpreted the sublime through a female or feminist perspective. And then currently I have a show opening next week. It's called Small is Beautiful. It's 16 artists interpret the work of the groundbreaking eco-economist E.F. Shoemaker, who wrote a wonderful book, Small is Beautiful, in the early 70s, and he was the inspiration for the show, which looks at, let's see if I can have a nice quote from Shoemaker that tells it all. Let's see. By focusing on small-scale manageable enterprises and local self-sufficiency, you put fewer demands on the environment and vulnerable populations. So the small works in the show reflect these ideas. And so all of that kind of is in keeping with thinking critically at all times as a painter, and in that way, keeping myself engaged and going.
Oh, great.
There you go.
I have the pleasure to introduce Marianne Webster. And I believe she was born in California and was raised there. She got her BA in art education at the Brigham Young University and received a master's in fine arts at the University of Utah. And she did post-degree studies at the San Francisco State University. Webster has taught ceramics at numerous schools, including Utah State University, University of Utah, and Brigham Young University. Marianne's work deals with man's effect on the natural world. So Marianne, would you please take it away?
Thank you. I'm very happy to be talking about the environment right now because I think we're at a critical stage. And I first saw Bernard Palissy's work late at night in the stacks of a university, and it was like an epiphany for me. And this is Palissy's work. He lived from 1510 to 1590, and he was living in Saint, kind of an estuarian situation where he would go out and do plaster castings. No one had done this before, or thought of this before. He invented his own glazes because glazes did not exist. He usually includes a snake in his compositions. And it's been written that the idea of Islamic gardens as sacred gardens and then the snake invading the paradise was a theme that he was exploring. He lived a very long time, died in jail as a Protestant during the 40 Years' War, during that period of religious strife. But he was also very passionate about his work. He's a national hero in France. There's a life-size bronze sculpture of him in front of the National Ceramics Museum at Sèvres. And he was known for, when his kiln did not reach temperature, it was a wood burning kiln. You can't really go back and fix that. If it doesn't get hot enough, it just didn't work. So he started throwing in his furniture, and then when it still didn't reach the right temperature, which they would just gauge by looking in the kiln, then he started pulling up his floorboards, and his wife wasn't happy about that, but he had a very colorful life and is much beloved in France. None of which I knew, just rummaging in the stack. So he was my epiphany. So I decided that after 500 years, someone needs to show what's happened to nature now. He was a part of the late Renaissance Mannerist idea of trompe-l'œil, which means fooling the eye. And he was trying to fool the eye of the viewer here into thinking that, oh, this is real nature. He was passionate about nature. And so I decided someone needs to show what's happened to nature after 500 years. So my works began to show, well, they started out showing just damaged and mutant nature. In this one called The Shallow Edge of the Gene Pool, I'm complaining about the loss of biodiversity, and lots of species are going extinct every day. And there's an impact of genetic alteration of seeds that is harming the planet. If you look in the mosses around the central figures, you will see little embryos of we don't know what. In the center is a mutant plant, an animal creature, I cast fish bones and then put them on top of this back of this plant form. And I was just trying to express a concern for what is happening to the natural world. I also included a snake because I do think that there is an invasion of the garden, a perfect nature. And so the snake remains in most of my pieces. This piece I put in a firing. Unlike Bernard Palissy, I have access to many kilns and many types of firing. So I put this in a soda firing, and I wanted to create the effect of a burnt look. Things are damaged. The colors in this photo aren't quite accurate. They're a little deeper. I was also really fascinated by the vitrification process of turning mud to glass. And then I discovered the ideas in ancient alchemy about clay being acted upon by fire, well, earth as clay being acted upon by fire, air, and water. And I thought that really applied to this process. I like the imagery of the idea that this creative process was, you could also create a human. Some of my pieces are figurative. And the idea of the homunculus in alchemy is like that you can create a human from clay and put life into it. And there are stories about golem figures that were sort of unformed life without a soul that alchemists would create. So a lot of my figurative works refer to that, but it all goes back to this fascinating process of vitrification from clay. And because I started out in drawing and painting, I had a different approach to using the ceramics materials. And I wanted to paint with these glass-like materials. And it was very, very fascinating, very, very fun to do this, just to open the kiln door and after a firing and just see, it's like Christmas, like, whoa. So you're entering into a partnership with fire and earth and water and air as well during the formative process. So I just still have this passion for this process. So there's also the idea that water as the source of all life, which in Islamic gardens, they would have 4 sacred rivers flowing from a tree of life. And that is thought to be a big influence on Palissy's work. I came upon, after I made this piece, this piece is called The Shallow Edge of the Gene Pool. I found a country western song called I'm From the Shallow End of the Gene Pool, and thought that was appropriate and interesting. The singer was bemoaning his state. And I think humor is a good thing nowadays. We're confronted with many events detailing the destruction of the environment on a day-by-day basis. Some of my pieces are just cast fish bones in a sea environment of what was a coral reef, and that those pieces refer to the fact that scientists say that coral reefs are going away very rapidly, and we could not have any at all in 20 years. So casting fish bones instead of fish, as Palisi did, was my way of showing a dead environment. So I have other pieces that are icons that are referring to the impact of computers on our lives, and computer Madonnas, inspired by Richard Brautigan's poem called All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace. And that's a phrase used in the poem where he playfully claims that he wrote this in the 60s, mind you. A computer was the size of a whole room. And he said, we will be freed of our labors by computers and joined back to nature, all watched over by machines of loving grace. So the computer idea is also something that impacts us. And I use those in my pieces as well. Usually icons of scary Madonnas with circuit boards embedded in their chests. And so everything I'm doing is basically a statement on contemporary life and the environmental plight. Salt Lake City recently had a never before seen windstorm. It was like a hurricane without rain, and 100-year-old trees and new trees as well were just completely uprooted by this wind, like 90-mile-an-hour wind. And afterwards, to see the damage, it was disturbing, because they were saying flat out, this is global warming, and this can happen again. And so events recently have been rather apocalyptic in the Rocky Mountains. One thing I noticed was when very large trees were uprooted, they would pull up parts of the sidewalk and creating ramps. So all the skateboarders were out. And I thought, oh, if there's ever a real apocalypse, the skateboarders will be out there skating on it. So I think ideas about popular culture, humor, and then just being educated about what is going on and speaking up. Plastics are another one. I haven't even begun to deal with plastics in my works, but now there's microplastics, and microplastics come from just laundering synthetic fabrics, and they make their way into the ecosystem from wastewater, and they don't even know how to get rid of these. There's an island of plastic in the Pacific Gyre, which is where currents come together in the ocean, and it's bigger than a continent. And they're saying now we have more plastic, or the same amount of plastic that has always been created, because we don't know how to get rid of this stuff. We have so many issues that confront us, and I just want to point out what is happening and try to do something about it in that way, but also it's just a love of the vitrification process. Another thing I wanted to point out was I'm using a lot of fish. We're not even supposed to eat a lot of fish because of mercury pollution and dioxin pollution. Pregnant women are probably warned normally these days to not eat it at all. And we're supposed to limit our amounts of large fish like rockfish and other fish that have been very popular edible species. The idea that the snake's invasion of paradise, I think we're frequently acting in the role of the snake, and we need to turn it around, because water as the source of all life, and my fascination for water leads me to the idea that whatever affects the water and fishes also impacts the human body as well. There are some other ideas that my work deals with. The idea that Carl Jung, who's one of my heroes, interpreted alchemy as symbolic of psychic processes expressed in pseudochemical language. And so this process of alchemy, the search for eternal life, or whatever they thought they were looking for, the process itself is fascinating.
Great.
And the idea of these materials that can come together and create what, gold, glass, whatever. So those things also really influence my art.
Great. Thanks, Marianne. That's great. And go on to the to introduce Philip Zimmerman. Thank you. Philip was born in Oregon in 1956. He's been exhibiting his work since 1978 in numerous spaces in Portland, New York, San Francisco, and Houston. The AIDS epidemic has been a focus of much of his work, which also addresses issues of life, death, and beauty. So, Philip, it's your turn.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this forum. This is wonderful. I'm not really sure how to get started here. You have exhibited a couple of real important pieces of mine that the museum has collected over the years, and they both deal with responses, or how I responded to crisis in my life in real time. And so as you mentioned, I grew up in Oregon. I grew up in kind of a remote cowboy country, and I grew up as a gay kid there, and it was really quite difficult. And so there's an alienation that kind of happens in those situations, and I decided just to head to that dark place and see if I could find my way through it. Part of that is you end up identifying as the other, and by so doing, you embrace a vision that a lot of people don't understand. And so that's what the book Caesar Boo is about, sort of working through an identity and kind of a fracture of yourself and trying to reintegrate. And so it's a very personal, cathartic sort of process. I began this in 1981 when I got a grant from the Metropolitan Arts Commission in Portland, and I was also in a band, a punk band at this point. And so fortunately I had these activities to work myself through whatever it was I had to deal with, and get to the other side. And so in a way, it's sort of like you name your demons, you can control them. And I think this is part of what's going on in this work. The American Christ, or White Christ, is a piece that began with a discarded drawing board that I picked up on the streets of New York City when I lived there. And that was a response. It started out as a sort of a way of magically materializing a savior. And then in the process, as all my friends started to die from AIDS and suffer, I realized there was no savior, you know. And so this work, which started out as kind of a hopeful exercise, became dark for me. So it's painful, but that's kind of what, you know, what it's about. I'm interested in magic. I'm interested in magical thinking and the futility of it, and yet people continue to celebrate it and use it, including our government. So these are kind of issues that I think about and work with in my work. So ask me a question. I that would actually help.
Oh, we could kind of start off with an open table, kind of, you know, open this up to everybody, all the panelists, and just the big question for you is this kind of, I guess you mentioned there was a non-belief, but you kind of still were intrigued by the notions of magical thinking. And I mean, it's sort of an ambiguous, it's a very ambiguous statement. You sort of are interested in it, but realize its futility, but still carry forward. And I just find that intriguing that you can.
Well, that's an interesting thing to raise. You know, I was baptized Methodist and raised Presbyterian. So even though I may have moved beyond a lot of that, there is a sort of a template in my head at how I approach life, image making myself in response to the world, and where I fit in. That is very much based on that early template that was set. And you know, as much as you may want to leave a religious upbringing, there are some real basic structures that you never leave. So that maybe that goes to answer some of that, but you know, you just.
I think it does. Well, here's a question for everybody. I mean, how is what's happening in the world today, and there's plenty of things happening on a macro scale, affecting your thinking and your practice as an artist?
Well, I would say massively. I have never figured out how one can be an artist in the world and not be affected. I mean, artists are pretty sensitive people. We tend to question everything. And so that's going to include this wide range of subjects. And so when I quit making abstract art, decided I didn't want to be an artist in a safe little bubble, formalist bubble. And of course that was happening in the arts in general, where we moved away from formalism, which was really art for art's sake, and just questioning the parameters of art, and we'll make this little adjustment this year and it'll be radical and we'll have a whole new thing going, and that essentially you could say drove the modernist project for 100 and some years, questioning the what art was. And but I feel fortunate that art became a lot more than that we could actually, with feminism, consider our identity. We could bring in anything we wanted really as a viable subject for art. And so in listening to everyone, realizing that, especially for Marianne and myself, that the environment is an extremely critical issue, and it just didn't make sense to me, and I'm sure Marianne as well, to dither around with this green next to this red and think that that was a sufficient thing to devote one's life to. So for me, it's very important to stay informed and engaged with what's going on around one, but not abandon what is important about art. And as I was listening to everyone, I actually sort of came up with another question on top of that, and thinking, well, we all have these concerns. You know, we see the political concerns, environmental, identity, all these things. What is it about art? We're not journalists. We're not scientists. So we're not just writing a tract and saying, hey guys, get on board with global warming. As artists, we're doing a lot more than that. And I actually wanted to put that out to the other artists as well, as to what you as an artist are bringing to the examination of these issues. For me as a painter, and I'll open it up to everybody else, being a painter allows one to bring in so much more to the conversation, let's say about the environment, just zero in on that for a minute. Whereas a scientist is going to write a paper showing the effects of CO2 on the ocean or whatever. And that's a document, that's important factual study of something. But as a painter, there's so many levels at which I'm bringing awareness, and that would encompass history, the aesthetic realm, the literary realm, the philosophical realm, and the spiritual realm, all of which everyone has touched on today. That's not something a scientific paper will generally do. And so as artists, you know, we can open this conversation up hugely in ways with just an image. And I dare not say simple image, because none of what we're saying here today is simple, but we have a chance to bring all those other things to bear with the products of our imagination, with what the visuals that we put out there. And I think that's what makes being an artist in these times really important. So I'll stop and let other people.
Marianne?
Well, I think what Constance has said has resonated with me quite strongly, and I appreciate your ideas, Constance. And I also really, really appreciate, Philip, your work. And actually, I've been going to get to Logan from Salt Lake City and see this show, because you both have inspired me to really want to take a closer look at what you've done, because I think it's extraordinary, and it resonates with, I think this show theme resonates with everyone, and it certainly resonates with me. And looking for ways to just do something about what is happening is probably the most healthy response to our plight, because it does look like we're going down politically, culturally, in the ways that we care for the poor. It's not adequate in the ways that we care for our environment, which touches on our own survival. It's not adequate. And so just as artists, finding ways to express that. Philip, your ideas about spirituality and where we're at, what we're struggling with, are also really resonating with me. And I just want to thank you both for your work, and I will get a closer look in Logan.
Thank you.
Philip, any thoughts about what's going on politically right now?
Yeah, wear a mask. People,
Hey.
you know, we got to survive this in order to make the change. So, um, that's my big statement.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, hope springs eternal. Let's put it that way. It is a dark time. It's an extremely challenging time, and I have to say, every day I struggle with how I, as an artist, can have any input or can even be seen in the chatter and the atmosphere. I mean, you know, it's really a challenge to think, how does what I do in any way impact this very toxic situation? And I don't know if it does, but I think collectively, one thing that helps me in this is, you know, we as artists do what we do best. We engage the traditions that we work in. We have our ear to the ground. We put our work out there. And so I would say that's actually available to any profession, whether you're a doctor or a mailman, mailwoman, teacher, accountant, whatever. I think we all have to act consciously at this moment. And so we are, as artists, it's very clear just from listening to everyone that we're all acting very consciously in what we do. And so I think if you look at that collective effort and say, look, I can't do this on my own, but I'm going to bring 16 artists together in an exhibition, and they'll bring all their people, and we'll put it out there on social media. You start to feel a lot more positive. And that's been really important for me in the COVID era, is not feeling that I'm working in isolation, but feeling that yes, I am very connected to other artists as well.
And we have I'm not sure if our audience realizes it, but you can type in a question if you have one of the artists. And we do have one here. And it's, given what Constance was saying about the capacity and role of artists, what are you making now? How do you make a decision about what to focus on, given the weight of everything happening in 2020? Question is from Katie.
Well, I don't want to hog all the time, so maybe somebody else should answer first, and then I'll chime in.
I'd like to hear from Philip.
Okay. Well, right now, well, for the last bit of time, I've been working on a film about a performance that happened in San Francisco about 50 some years ago, but that I'm still thinking it impacts what's going on now. And it's Kenneth Anger was here. He did a particular an invocation of Lucifer in the fall equinox in '67, and so I'm investigating that and recreating some of the rituals and filming them and interviewing people who participated in that event. And it's about intention, magic, how your will impacts the space that you live in, and the changing space of the city now where all these things are disappearing. So part of it is just trying to preserve the history, the psychic history, the magical history, and all of that, and getting a better understanding of where we came from and maybe help see where we're going. So that's kind of what I'm doing.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, I think as I gave in my opening comments, you know, how do you decide what to make? And I'm going to take a flying guess. That might be a student that asked that question because, there's an endless, infinite amount of stuff one can involve one's practice in, as a painter, what to paint. So, I build on ideas. A lot of this is intuitive. I always think an art practice is the process of harmonizing one's personal outlook with a much wider cultural or worldview. How do you bring those into contact? How do they meaningfully meet up? So, you've got this very personal view of things that's driven by your history. Philip talking about growing up in Oregon and, all that important stuff in his development. So you've got all that going, and yet you're in the world, you're in the culture. So those two things have to meet up somehow in a very impactful, meaningful way in order to be making what I think is art that's worth looking at. I also think it's the artist's job to make you want to look at art. It's my job as a painter to make you want to look at it. And once I've suckered you in, then you're going to deal with the ideas as they are revealed to you through a kind of slow process of looking and thinking. So, the what do I paint today idea is part of a very, very long process. If you hang in there long enough, and you're receptive. You just kind of open yourself up and say, wow, the environmental crisis is just horrific. How do I harmonize my personal aesthetic goals, my needs to paint every day, the pleasures and joys I get out of making stuff with this horrendous thing that's going on? Other artists deal with more with other issues, more political issues, but since I've had this long career, I've had a chance to really, as I say, see the threads. I keep going back to being that 3-year-old girl wandering around in the woods. I don't know where my mother was, but I was out wandering in the woods. And so that's the personal part that now is coming into contact or into tension or into collision, harmony, however you want to look at it, with the contemporary world. And that's what I have to try to come to terms with in my painting. And so it's a challenge, but it's engaging. It's what keeps the process going. It keeps it really fun. I think the rest of you could agree that making this stuff is just tremendously satisfying and interesting. It never stops being. So, yeah.
Well, good. I think maybe we should wrap it up. It's been about an hour. And I wanted to thank everybody again for participating and taking the time to do so. I wanted to just also say that the exhibition has been made possible with the support of the Utah Division of Arts and Museums. So we're thankful to have that support from the state here. So, and I wanted to remind people that we'll be doing a series of these artist talks in October. There'll be one every week, so expect to get a notice about the next one, which will focus on another exhibition here at the museum called Women, Surrealism, and Abstraction. So thank you for listening, and thank you, panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.